David Bowie once wrote a song called "I Am Afraid of Americans." But it is in fact Americans who are afraid, because at the end of the day, there is no better political motivator than fear. We like to think that as Americans we have evolved politically, that we are not as easily manipulated by fear, we are not as easily driven by our fears. Ladies and gentlemen, that is blatantly false. Americans at the end of the day have always been fearful, and this has always caused a rise of one political movement: populism. But what is populism? Populism is simply appeasing the fear of the masses. But what have Americans always been fearful of? Change. Throughout our history, Americans have always been fearful of change, and we've responded in similar ways. And when I say always been fearful of change, I mean always. History gives us all the examples we need of this. Let's look at Andrew Jackson, aka Old Hickory. Jackson was another run-of-the-mill populist. At the time of Jackson, the government had recently started investing in infrastructure projects and had started investing into the Bank of the United States. Americans at the time started to fear this, and they started to fear big government, and they started to fear the politicians that were bringing this change. Jackson stood up in the election of 1824, and he firmly believed in small government. He won decisively. He was actually, to quote Smithsonian Magazine, considered the noblest tree in the forest during that election, the forest being politicians. He was also considered a man of the people, even though he was extremely wealthy. Notice any parallels? One of the things Jackson was vehemently against was the Bank of the United States. Officially, he believed the bank to be unconstitutional and believed in states' rights, but to be honest with you now, to historians, it seems like it just didn't make sense to him. And it also didn't make sense to the people who supported him, which tended to be rural voters. Jackson was able to appease the fear of the American people by being against this bank. Why? Because recently, in 1819, an economic panic had occurred. And this panic, which was simply a financial bubble burst, led to mass fear of banks. Jackson played this and was able to shut down the Bank of the United States. Jackson also appeased another fear of the American people, the fear of Native Americans. Native Americans at the time were being given rights by the federal government to some degree. And the American people feared this. They also feared the integration of these Native Americans into American society, and they also feared Native Americans in general. Why? Because violent skirmishes were occurring between Native Americans and white settlers. Jackson proceeded to supporting Indian removal, and he did so by supporting the expulsion of the 5 major civilized tribes in the United States. The five civilized tribes were the Seminoles, the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee. He was able to effectively remove all of them, with the exception of the Cherokee. The Cherokee had treaties to back their claims to statehood, and the Cherokees sued. They took him to the Supreme Court, and in the case Worcester versus Georgia, the Cherokee stated that they are a sovereign state and they should have the right to statehood. The Supreme Court ruled in the favor of the Cherokee Nation. However, Jackson, being a populist, he had mass support of the American people. And then, in 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land. The Dahlonega gold rush occurred, and thousands of white settlers moved into Cherokee territory, and there was nothing they could do about it. Jackson, having popular support, proceeded to deporting thousands of Native Americans to modern-day Oklahoma. It is sort of ironic, actually. The man elected for small government expanded government greatly through these acts. There was no predecessor of his who abused their power as much as Jackson did. After Jackson came another wave of populism with the KnowNothings. Now, their name originates from secret societies who when their members were asked about, they stated they simply knew nothing about. It was very creative. With the KnowNothings, they had a fear of immigration. And they feared immigration for 2 reasons. One was blatant racism. The KnowNothings were Protestant nativists who believed that the mass immigration of Catholic Europeans would be detrimental to American society. They believed that these immigrants, who were trying to escape famine and economic despair from places like Ireland and Italy, would never be able to integrate effectively into American society, and they also believed that these immigrants would never be truly American due to their allegiance to the Pope. The second reason was jobs. The Know-Nothings believed that these immigrants were stealing jobs from Americans, and Americans were receiving lower wages, and the Americans were not able to get the best jobs. And they also blamed these immigrants for a rise in violent and sexual crimes. Again, notice anything? After the Know-Nothings came the People's Party. They were also known as the Populist Party, and they are probably the most famous populists in American history. They were a left-wing agrarian party, and their rise occurred partially due to another panic, the Panic of 1893. This time, basically overinvestment in railroad occurred and a bubble burst, causing the economy to go into freefall. After this, they too didn't trust banks, and they also didn't trust currency supporting the gold standard or having money backed by gold. They also supported labor and farmers' unions, which was opposite to the laissez-faire, or the complete free market economy style at the time. And they were built primarily on the fear of being left behind. At the time, the rich were increasing, their power was increasing, and the populace believed that they had all the opportunity, and the poor were being left behind. Industrialization was also occurring, increasing the likelihood of this. And the lower classes at the time also felt that the wealthy were also able to influence politics too much due to their ability to donate. And this led to their anti-corruption stance as well. And actually, in fact, the head of the snake is William Jennings Bryan, the leader of the Populist Party. The Populist Party became so successful that they basically absorbed the Democratic Party, and in fact, Bryan was the Democratic presidential nominee 3 times. And populist ideals from the People's Party remained with the Democratic Party for decades to come. After the Know-Nothings came Huey Long. He was also known as Kingfish. Now, Kingfish was almost a communist. He believed in wealth redistributions, and they were extremely radical. He believed that anybody with an income over $8 million should have the remainder of their wealth confiscated, and then $5,000 be given to every single American. That would be about $72,000 today, adjusting for inflation. He was elected during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, something was occurring that had never occurred before. Poverty was spreading like wildfire. The American people had never had to face poverty to this degree. Never had hardworking Americans had to struggle to survive. And Huey Long offered a change from the norm that was occurring. He didn't offer a change. He offered to counter this change by offering Americans to never have to fear poverty again. And he might have been successful too, except for he was assassinated in 1935, putting an end to all of his plans. Now, let's take a look at the election of 2016. Americans are afraid again, and we saw the rise of not one, but 2 populists, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Let's talk about what led to the rise of both of these men. 2008. The stock market crash of 2008 caused mass fear of 2 things: being left behind and globalization. The 2008 crisis was basically caused by banks issuing subprime mortgages to everybody. Basically, they were giving everybody mortgages, no matter if you could afford them or not. And once people couldn't start paying them back, banks started defaulting, people started losing their homes, they started losing their jobs. And this caused mass fear of being left behind. People thought we were going to return to the times of the Great Depression, where poverty was going to be widespread in the United States. And then something else happened. With everybody losing jobs, something came to view: outsourcing of jobs, which had occurred for years in the United States, but the public started paying attention to it and saying, look, these jobs are American jobs, but they're going out of the country. And this caused a fear of globalization as well. And this impacted both the right and the left of the political spectrum. The left's response was Bernie Sanders and his democratic socialist ideals. He is for things such as free college and free healthcare for all Americans, and he is against things such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the North American Free Trade Agreement, which are both free trade agreements that he believes are detrimental to the American worker. He is also anti-big business, and he is effectively anti-billionaire, and he believes that Wall Street billionaires have too much influence in our political system because of, again, their ability to donate, which he compares to legal corruption. He is the ideal leftist populist. And he is also similar to the populists of the 1890s. He appeases the fear of people being left behind with his policies on big business and healthcare and college, and he is also similar to Huey Long in the fact that he supports effective wealth redistribution. Free college and free healthcare are effective wealth redistribution. Donald Trump, on the other hand, does the exact same thing, just with a little bit of a different style. He responded to globalization by appealing to nativists and xenophobes. His use of slogans such as "Build the Wall" and "Make America Great Again" has become the cry of xenophobes, such as the KKK and the American Nazi Party, who Trump has failed to distance himself from. He has also promised to roll back government regulation. This appeases the fear of those feeling like they're being left behind, because a lot of those people are manufacturing workers and coal miners who have false hopes that we can return to manufacturing dominance. The American economy has moved on, and that is simply not possible. He also appeals to rural voters who believe their way of life is under attack. Now, Jackson is similar to Trump because Trump called Jackson massively successful. Of course, to Jackson, being massively successful was disobeying the Supreme Court and blatantly doing unconstitutional things, but it's not like Trump has proposed to do anything like this, right? Trump is also similar to KnowNothings on his stance on the deportation of undocumented immigrants and his Muslim ban. He is a through-and-through nativist and xenophobe. We must realize that Donald Trump was elected into office simply because his challenger, Hillary Clinton, could not appease the fear of Americans. Trump offered reverting to the past. Clinton offered going into the future. And Trump won because he validated and calmed the fears of some Americans, just like so many before him. The fact is, Trump came into office because he is a populist, and he is neither the first, nor will he be the last populist for the American people. Historically speaking, the fear of the American people has generally been the same. We fear banks after every major economic crisis. Examples include 1819, 1893, 2008, the Great Depression. A lot of us still don't trust banks today. And then a lot of Americans today also fear big government. They fear that it will control too much of our lives and we will lose our precious freedom. Some Americans today also still fear immigration. And an example of this is the anti-Catholic feelings that have been in the United States for years. In fact, President John F. Kennedy, his ability to be president was doubted because he was a Catholic, and it was believed that he would not be able to answer to the American people. He would instead answer to the Pope. Now we direct that fear today towards undocumented immigrants and Muslims, and we believe that Muslims can never be truly American and that Hispanics can never be truly American. The bottom line is, the fear of the American people has not evolved. We are scared of the same things as our ancestors were, and our descendants will probably be scared of the same things that we are. And they too will have their own wave of populism. Thank you.